And welcome back to the Word Encounter, episode 84. Yesterday, we covered Nehemiah up to chapter 4. So today we're going to continue on in chapter 5. Chapter 5 takes a kind of interesting break. In chapter 4, they were reconstructing the wall and the obstacles that came with reconstructing the wall of Jerusalem. And then he in chapter 5 takes a little bit of a little sideways, and then in chapter 6 we get back to the wall. So in chapter 5 it says in verse 1, there was a widespread outcry from the people and their wives against their Jewish countrymen. And so there was an issue amongst the Jews in the countryside, and as it came to pass, some of the richer Jews were taking advantage of some of the other Jews. And it says in verse 6, I became angry. This is Nehemiah. I became extremely angry when I heard their outcry against these complaints. After seriously considering the matter, I accused the nobles and officials, saying to them, each of you is charging his countrymen interest. So I called a large assembly against them and said, we have done our best to buy back our Jewish countrymen who were sold to foreigners, but now you sell your own countrymen. So what were they doing? So essentially what was happening is that the poorer Jews had to pay tax to the kingdom, and they couldn't continue to pay tax. Remember, they were under the Persian government now, and they couldn't continue to pay tax to the king and maintain their properties. And so some of the richer Jews would buy them out. And so they bought out their property and then charge, or give them loans, I should say, and then charge them maybe exorbitant interest rates on those loans, such that the poor Jews could not continue to hold on to their land, and then therefore the richer Jews acquired their land. And so that's what was happening. And so it says in verse 9, then I said, what you are doing isn't right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of your God? And so he's saying, what are you doing to your brothers? Why are you taking their land underhandedly the way you're doing it? Don't you fear the Lord our God? Because you're not supposed to be doing this. In verse 11, it says, Nehemiah says, return their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses to them immediately, along with the percentage of the money, grain, new wine, and fresh oil that you have been assessing them. In other words, give them everything back that you unjustly took from them, is what Nehemiah is saying. And verse 12, they responded, we will return these things and require nothing more from them. We will do as you say. And so the richer Jews acquiesced and says, okay, we'll give everything back. And then the second half of chapter 5, Nehemiah takes another little jog here and basically wants to bring the Lord's attention to what Nehemiah, has been doing to make sure that the Lord doesn't forget him. And it says in verse 14, furthermore, from the day King Artaxerxes appointed me to be their governor in the land of Judah. And so I don't know if I went over this before, but not only did he go back, the cupbearer Nehemiah, back to Judah, but the king made him the governor west of the Euphrates. And so he's the governor now. He's the head dog. And it says to be their governor. I and my associates never ate from the food allotted to the governor. Verse 15. The governors who preceded me had heavily burdened the people, taking from them food and wine, as well as a pound of silver. And their subordinates also were taken from the people. And so Nehemiah is saying, the governors before me took advantage of the people. But he's essentially saying, look, Lord, I'm not doing that. And then we drop down, what is this, I guess this is verse 18. It says, but I didn't demand the food allotted to the governor. In other words, I didn't take what was rightfully mine to take. I didn't demand the food allotted to the governor because the burden on the people was so heavy. And then in verse 19, this is what he says. Remember me favorably, my God, for all that I have done for this people. So Nehemiah is putting a little plug in for himself. Remember me, Lord. When you think about me, everything that I didn't do, that I could have done to take advantage of this people, but I did not do it because I fear you, God. And so, and then in chapter 6, we go back to the construction of the wall. And it says, when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall and that no gap was left in it, Sanballat and Geshem sent me a message, come, Let's meet together in the village of Oh No, in the village of the Oh No Valley. Oh no, in the village of the Oh No Valley. They were planning to harm me. Verse 3. So I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing important work and cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave and go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same proposal, and I gave them the same reply. And so Sanballat and Gershom, they are Geshem, I should say, not Gershom, Geshem. They did not like Nehemiah. They did not like what he was doing. And so they were trying to harm him. And so they said, come, meet us in the valley. Let's meet together in the villages of the Ono Valley. But Nehemiah could see through their schemes, and so he wasn't going to go down there so that he could put himself in harm's way. and so Sanballat sent him another message, and basically accusing him of trying to plot a rebellion against the kingdom. And so, but Nehemiah wasn't falling for that. And so he didn't go for a 5th time. And so then in verse 10, we move on to a different event. And it says, I went to the house of Shemaiah, who was restricted to his house. I don't know why he was restricted to his house. He said, let's meet at the house of God inside the temple. Let's shut the temple doors because they're coming to kill you. They're coming to kill you tonight. And so Shemaiah is trying to convince him that they're coming to kill him tonight. So come, let's go to the temple, shut the doors, implying that you'll be safe. I'll keep you safe, whatever. Verse 11, but I, Nehemiah, said, should a man like me run away? How can someone like me enter the temple and live? I will not go. Verse 12, I realized that God had not sent him because of the prophecy spoke against me. Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He was hired so that I would be intimidated, do as he suggested, sin, and get a bad reputation in order that they could discredit me. And so again, Nehemiah is getting discernment from the Lord, with regard to the schemes and plots and things that are going on against him. And so he's discerning the voice of the Lord, and therefore that discernment is then guiding his actions. And oh Lord, how desperately we need that in our lives in these times. We need a discernment of your voice, and so that we can hearken up unto your voice and do exactly what you tell us to do. Not what we think we should do, not what we heard we should do or whatever, but what you have instructed us to do. That is what we want to hear, and that is what we want to do. And then in verse 14, it says, my God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat for what they have done, and also the prophetess Noadiah and the other prophets who wanted to intimidate me. And so Nehemiah is calling on the voice of the Lord to hear me, Lord. And these people, and he's calling them out by name, they've been trying to harm me. And so, Lord, I'm pleading with you that they would not succeed and that they would get what they deserve, is essentially what Nehemiah is saying. And then in verse 15, it says, the wall was completed in 52 days on the 25th day of the month of Elul. Yeah, Elul. When all our enemies heard this, all the surrounding nations were intimidated and lost their confidence, for they realized that this task had been accomplished by our God. Now think about it, 52 days, that's not even 2 months. And as we discussed yesterday, if this is an accurate description of the wall, which is about 2.5 miles long, about 40 feet high, and about 8 feet wide, doing that in less than 2 months, with hand construction, as it used to be done in the day, placing stones and that sort of thing. It had to be the hand of God that assisted building this wall. And so it says that apparently the other nations acknowledged that and realized that, and they became intimidated by it. And so we go on to chapter 7, and we see that it says, when the wall had been rebuilt and I had the doors installed, the gatekeepers, singers, and Levites appointed, then I put my brother Hanani in charge of Jerusalem, with Hananiah commander of the fortress, because he was faithful, who feared God more than most. And so now Nehemiah is appointing people in charge of various aspects of things. And one of the criteria is how faithful they were to the Lord. And so he's saying that a man who feared God more than most. And so that's why Hananiah was commander of the fortress. And in verse 4, it says, the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and no houses had been built yet. Then my God put it into my mind to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the people to be registered by genealogy. And so he's looking over the city. This wall is completed, a spacious city, but very few people. Then he remembered, there are people that came before me, that came with Zerubbabel, and then people that came with Ezra. And so then what happened was he found the genealogical book of the people that came with Zerubbabel. And then the rest of chapter 7, the majority of it goes over essentially the same thing that it went over before in the book of Ezra, I believe it was, when Zerubbabel came and listed all the families and the numbers of the families and so on and so forth. And so chapter 7 goes over all that and says in verse 66, the whole combined assembly numbered 42,360, not including the 7,337 male and female servants, as well as their 245 male and female singers. And so he found that book, and from that genealogical book, then now he could go about planning the repopulation or resettling of Jerusalem of the Jews that had preceded him. And so in chapter 8, we go on, and it says, on the first day of the 7th month, the priest Ezra brought the law before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding. So if you could listen with understanding, I guess you were invited to come and hear this. And it says in verse 5, Ezra opened the book in full view of all the people, since he was elevated above everyone. As he opened it, all the people stood up. So he opened the book of the law, and all the people stood up in order to honor the reading of the word. Verse 6, Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and with their hands uplifted, all the people said, Amen, amen. Then they knelt low and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. And then it says in verse 7, Jeshua, Bani, Sherebiah, Jamin, Akub, but it lists a whole bunch of Levites. And it says, explain the law to the people as they stood in their places. And so the Levites, the priests, then proceeded to explain to the law to the people. In essence, they began to teach them the law. In verse 8, they read out of the book of the law of God, translating and giving the meaning so that the people could understand what was read. And so this is similar as to what happens in churches and synagogues today. You know, the word gets read, then it gets explained, expounded on and whatnot, so people can understand what's in it and not just take what is said, but actually understand it. And to me, this is to me, this is, the Lord telling his people, look, you need to understand what's in my word. You need to understand what's in my word. The onus is on you to understand what's in my word. I have my teachers, my rabbis, whatever you want to call them, priests, shepherds, pastors, whatever, in place to explain things to you, but it's on you to understand what's in here. And this is a pretty big motivation as to why I'm doing this, is because I want people to understand what's in the word and not just to take what they hear from somebody else that's in it. That's why we're going through this thing. And it says in verse 10, then he said to them, after they had done this, read the word, explained the word, he says, go eat what is rich, drink what is sweet, and send portions to those who have nothing prepared. Since today is holy to our Lord, do not grieve, because the joy of the Lord is your strength. And so what happened is that as the word was being read and explained, the people started weeping and crying because they realized how wretched their behavior had been. But then the word comes forth, go eat what is rich, drink what is sweet, and send portions to those who have nothing prepared. And so it says, no, we're celebrating. We're celebrating. It says in verse 12, then all the people began to eat and drink, send portions and have a great celebration, because they had understood the words that were explained to them. They celebrated the fact that they understood. They realized that this was from God, that God was trying to assist them in living, how to live rightly before him. And so as it's being explained and as they're understanding, now they're celebrating. That's an awesome response, celebrating their understanding, you know. And so we go over to chapter 9, and we see that on the 24th day of this month, on the 24th day of this month, the Israelites assembled. They were fasting, wearing sackcloth, and had put dust on their heads. Those of the Israelite descent separated themselves from all foreigners, and they stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. While they stood in their places, they read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a fourth of the day, and spent another fourth of the day in confession and worship of the Lord their God. And it says Jeshua, Bani, Kadmiel, I guess, Shimbaniah, Bonai, Sherebiah. This is all these people, probably butchered their names, but all these people that were raised on the platform built for the Levites and cried out loudly to the Lord their God. Then the Levites said, "Stand up, blessed be the Lord your God from everlasting to everlasting." And then if you read in the rest of chapter 9, they go through a whole litany of the history of Israel and all the sins that they committed against the Lord, even though all of the good things that he had done for them, they experienced the good things and forgot them and then sin. And so they go through all these sins. And so, again, we have to remember these are exiles that have come out of Babylon, don't understand all the history. We're talking about hundreds of years of history prior to them. And so their history has to be constantly from generation to generation, every new generation coming along. They have to be educated on what happened in the past when they violated the rules, the tenets, and policies of the Lord. And so they go through this whole thing, and they recognize their sin. And so when they recognize their sin, then in verse 10 is about their commitment to a vow of faithfulness. And so again, in chapter 9, they go through all of the sins that they have committed so that the entire, public, the whole body of Israelites recognize, okay, this is what our ancestors have done wrong and the sins they committed. So they acknowledge those things. And it says in verse 10, well, this is the end of verse 9. In view of all this, we are making a binding agreement in writing on a sealed document containing the names of our leaders, Levites, and priests. Now in chapter 10, verse 1, those whose seals were on the document were the governor Nehemiah, and then it goes through a bunch of people that signed this document. So again, they went through all the list of sins that the Israeli nation had created or committed, and then they said, okay, we're done with that. Now we're going to sign this this document, this vow of faithfulness. And so Nehemiah and a whole bunch of people signed it. And it says in verse 28 of chapter 10, the rest of the people, the priests, Levites, gatekeepers, singers, and temple servants, along with their wives, sons, and daughters, everyone who is able to understand and who has separated themselves from the surrounding peoples to obey the law of God, joined with their noble brothers to commit themselves with a sworn oath to follow the law of God given through God's servant Moses, to obey carefully all the commands, ordinances, and statutes of the Lord our God. In verse 30, and so these are the details of the vow. This is what they vowed to do. We will not give our daughters in marriage to the surrounding peoples, and will not take their daughters as wives for our sons. And so they get back on the marriage things because this was a key thing. It says, we're not going to violate the Lord in this area. In verse 31, it says, when the surrounding peoples bring merchandise of any kind of grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or holy day. And so they're vowing not to work on the Sabbath day, which had been forgotten and violated. Then it says in verse 32, we will impose the following commands on ourselves: to give an eighth of an ounce of silver yearly for the service of the house of our God, And then it goes on. It says in verse 35, we will bring the first fruits of our land and of every fruit tree to the Lord's house year by year. We will also bring the first fruits of our sons and our livestock as prescribed by the law. We will bring the firstborn of our herds to the flocks of the house of our God, to the priests who serve in God's house. We will bring a loaf from our first batch of dough to the priests at the storerooms of the house of our God. We will also bring the first fruits of our grain offering of every fruit tree and of the new wine and fresh oil. A tenth of our land's produce belong to the Levites, for the Levites are to collect 1/10 offering in our architectural towns. A priest from Aaron's descendants is to accompany the Levites when they collect the tenth, and the Levites are to take a tenth of this offering to the storehouses, to the storerooms of the treasury in the house of our God. For the Israelites and Levites are to bring the contributions of grain, new wine, and fresh oil to the storerooms where the articles of the sanctuary are kept, and where the priests who ministers are, along with the gatekeepers and singers. We will not neglect the house of our God. And so in this last section here, a lot of what they're vowing to do is to care for the house of God, because the house of God was the center of the community. It represented the heartbeat of the community. And when the temple got ignored, then the people suffered. And so they made sure that they were going to do what they were assigned to do, what they were obligated to do through the book of the law of Moses, in order to take care of the house of God. And so with that, we're going to conclude for today, and we're going to pick it up in chapter 11 tomorrow.